It's kind of wild, and it's good to know if you ever come across a deck that randomly has some guy gobbling up his kids, which are gods, so it's all symbolic, of course. Hey there, this is Ina from Taproot Tarot, and I love Tarot de Marseille and other historic tarots, and I'm working on improving my reading skills with the Tarot de Marseille, and I'd like to talk about how I use historical decks themselves to deepen and expand my understanding of the cards. Most of us will turn to various books, whether they're little white books or more extended research books, or videos or word of mouth to learn meanings of the cards. And, we can look at the cards and develop our own meanings through journaling and things like that. But I really found that keeping a variety of historical decks around me to kind of compare and get a sense of what people of various time periods were maybe thinking or trying to communicate through the art in these cards. These cards come from a time when people did communicate through more allegory and symbolism than what we're accustomed to today. So I think it's really fascinating to learn about that and to gain a variety of perspectives on each card by looking at a variety of different historical decks. So let's take a look at a few Marseille tarots as well as a couple of other decks to compare. And I'll give a few examples of some insights that I've had by comparing the different cards and look into those deeper meanings and contexts that arose, from that time period of each particular deck. All right, let's talk first about the Moon card. This one is from the DeVry Tarot. It's an American company. It's kind of an amalgamation of a few different decks, and this one is AGM's Convos Tarot, based on the Conver, of course. And so a little history of my background with tarot. I was never drawn to RWS decks. I've never really looked through one. And my first two decks were not in the RWS system and had moon cards that didn't really conform to this structure. And so I didn't see that these canines were howling at the moon. And I think now that I think about that, it's just so silly. But they don't look to me like, obviously there are two canines there, whether they're dogs or wild canines. And then there's a moon, so it seems like it would be obvious that they're howling. But it wasn't obvious to me. It looks more to me like they're interacting with each other, I suppose. So I don't really know what I was thinking. But as I was first learning the Marseille Tarot and the symbolism, it just never occurred to me that that's what they were doing. And somehow I never read anywhere that they were howling. Now, once I got the ancient Italian tarot, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think is based on the Soprafino, then it became pretty obvious that these are two dogs howling at the moon. And for whatever reason, it had just legitimately never occurred to me until the moment I saw this card. And actually, I love this card, except for the fact that the lobster is on the plate. Not really a fan of that. That's weird. But otherwise, the deck just made so much more sense to me and I know we kind of traditionally interpret it as, mysteries and, things that are shrouded and difficult to understand. But I think it's also, I understood it as, tapping into our own depths. And this added a layer onto it about understanding primal nature. These dogs are howling at the moon because that's their instinct. And it just so happened that the next day, after the first time I saw the ancient Italian tarot, the next day I drew the moon card from a different deck, one of the Marseille decks probably, and it was really relevant that I was able to relate that deck back to following my instincts and things like that. So that was really helpful. That's just a small example. Now I'd like to talk about Minchiate, which is a similar but different game from Tarocchi. It has 97 cards and most of the same cards that a Tarocchi deck will have, with a few exceptions and a bunch of additions. And one of the interesting features is that it includes all 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological virtues. And this is something I knew nothing about. I wasn't raised religious. I don't know anything about specific virtues. So I had to look these things up because I found it really interesting. So in our tarot deck that we're familiar with, it includes 3 possibly more, but at least 3 of the cardinal virtues, which are justice, fortitude, which we often call strength, and one of the ways she shows up is as somebody holding up a pillar that's trying to fall down. Of course, in the traditional Marseille deck, she is depicted taming a lion. And we often call her strength, but the virtue is fortitude, and so that's usually how I refer to it, as the card is fortitude. And then we have temperance. And additionally, we have the 4th cardinal virtue, which is prudence. Now, the Minchiate deck does not include a papess, so it is kind of conjectured, I suppose, that the papess is based on prudence, or that at the very least prudence is a decent substitute for papess if you are trying to use a Minchiate deck for divination. But what it got me thinking about, temperance and prudence, they do have different connotations, but we use them in much the same way, to refer to being measured and not being too extreme. So it just got me wondering about, what is the actual dictionary definition of both these words, and why do we specifically need both of those as virtues and both of those represented as cards? And so temperance is regulating your emotions, which I thought was interesting. We often think of temperance as, the temperance movement in the United States was banning alcohol. So I think that a lot of people kind of layer that on top of this card, layer that meaning onto it. But the root definition is regulating your emotions, whereas prudence is making practical decisions. And I think it's interesting that they're looking into a mirror, maybe doing some self-reflection, having some self-awareness to make practical decisions, perhaps while they're being tempted by this serpent. I don't know a lot about biblical allegory, but I do know some of it. And whereas with temperance, she has great skillful control over this water and the water vessels. And I think that's really interesting because there is quite a lot of discussion about when we started thinking about the different suits in elemental terms and which suits actually represent which elements. And I guess this just kind of lends some credibility to thinking of cups and water as emotions, because obviously that symbolism was relevant at the time that these cards were first being made. So that leaves the 3 theological virtues, which are hope, faith, and charity. And interestingly, charity is also referred to as love, and it means the putting love for a higher power or a higher purpose over love for yourself. And I think that's really interesting because obviously this card is not normally included in the usual tarot, but we do have the lover card, or what some folks will refer to as lovers. I think lover is more accurate, and it really kind of aligns with the way that I think of the lover card. So here's from the Universal Tarot de Marseille, based on the Burdell deck. And let me see here. And here's from that Debray deck again. So this is our usual Tarot de Marseille lover card. And the way I've always seen it, and usually, a lot of people will consider the person on the right to be a temptress and the person on the left to be the bride, or the person on the left to be a mother, and the person on the right to be his lover, and that he has to choose between, it's about the mom letting the son go, or it's about the man choosing between a temptress or a mistress and the ball and chain, and all of it is just really patriarchal ways of looking at this card. And to me, I see it more as making a choice between a higher purpose and your own personal wants. So, and the reason for that, the person on the left is portrayed with a crown, either a crown of laurels here or a golden crown. And I think in the case of a golden crown, we can see this card as, we can see the person on the left representing, queen and country. And, does he want to have a personal life with this person on the right? Or does he want to serve queen and country or a higher purpose? And in this card, it takes a little bit more of a botanical tactic. And she's got a crown of flowers on the right, and on the left, a crown of laurels. And a crown of laurels can represent another institution, maybe not, queen and country as the golden crown represents, but a crown of laurels can represent higher education or a profession or something like that. So I think it really is a choice between, some kind of a personal wish and a higher duty or obligation. And I think that's really kind of portrayed in the charity card, where you are to make a choice to love a higher purpose over love for yourself. Now the Minchiate does also include a love card or a lover, and this is an interesting depiction, and I think it's kind of depicting a similar theme, because I think the person being crowned, it kind of looks like he's choosing a higher purpose over himself, or to serve a higher purpose over himself. So I think that is still being depicted here. This deck I've been showing you is the Etruria Minchiate. And so when you see when it's a finer etching and painted coloration, that's the Etruria Minchiate. You'll sometimes see a more woodcut and stenciled or stamped coloration. So these are both the charity cards, but this is the Minchiate Fiorentine, and this is the Etruria. And Minchiate and Tarocchi for a long time were similar games. It's not like they were completely separated at first, and they over time just developed into two separate games. Minchiate apparently is an Italian slur, so if you speak Italian, please pardon my French. But really, apparently it kind of means fool, and as we know, the Fool card in the Triumphs is an exception or an excuse, I think, in the game. I don't know how to play either of these games, but I know a little bit about them, which I think is important. If we're using these card games, for studying them, it's good to have some idea of their original purpose. So I want to talk next about the Visconti Tarot, and I just think it's a good idea for us to have a Visconti Tarot on hand. If nothing else, to keep us humble. I think, we put a lot of importance into the Tarot de Marseille, and, considering that kind of the standard, and that is the deck that that all of the tarots that we use today, including the RWS, that's the symbolism that our modern tarots are based on. I think looking at the Visconti Sforza, which is the earliest, most complete tarot deck, it's from 1450. It's not necessarily the earliest deck, but it's the earliest one that's almost complete. Only 4 cards are missing from the original decks. So it's good to know, that the symbolism that we consider so important isn't necessarily even portrayed in the earliest decks. There was a variety of ways to portray these allegories, the triumphal tradition allegories, that didn't include a lot of the symbolic elements that we find so important today, that we put a lot of attention on. And, it just so happens that the Marseille Tarot that we know today just happened to be mass-produced in a print shop in a port town in France where it could be widely distributed. It originated in Italy, and these are not mass-produced cards. These are ones that were commissioned by specific artists. This deck, I think, is made by 2 different artists, plus the cards that were missing were added later. I think this is a good example here of what we would call the Hermit, but this is clearly Father Time. So the earliest decks depict Father Time, and you can kind of see how, with the crude nature of some of the woodcut printing, you can see how his spinal curvature could later, maybe be a little less clear and be interpreted as the hood that we see on the Hermit today. So here, this is the Debray deck. So there he is with his hood, in this case, and he's got a lantern. That's how we normally think of the Hermit. But I think at some point, the hourglass of Father Time it was a little bit unclear and was misinterpreted as a lantern. And, even in some of the very old decks, we have Kronos depicted. And The Chronos is the Greek concept of time, personification of time, which eventually developed into Father Time. And he was kind of combined with the Titan Cronus, even in antiquity, but especially during the Renaissance. So those two concepts were mixed up a little bit. And so Cronus, of course, is the Titan who is the father of Zeus and was known for eating his own kids. And so he's often depicted as eating his children. So some very old decks even have a depiction of Cronus gobbling up his kids instead of a hermit. So, it's kind of wild. And it's good to know if you ever come across a deck that randomly has some guy gobbling up his kids, which are gods. So it's all symbolic, of course. But then, interestingly, in the Etruria, Minchiate, we've got another depiction of Father Time. He's often depicted with a stag and two crutches. And then you see the hourglass up above him there. And he is often seen with a bow and arrow or a scythe, things like that. He's just known for gobbling up time, I guess. Again, I think looking at decks like this Visconti deck just kind of remind us that the symbolism that we feel is really important is all really kind of arbitrary. Here's the Fortitude card, which is depicted as, it's said to be Hercules not being very nice to this lion. Some people think that they're fighting together, but I doubt that's the case. I would like to think that. A very cool, very creepy, unnamed card. And actually all of these cards are unnamed because in Italy, these allegories didn't need labels. People knew the triumphal traditions and which triumphs were greater than which, and therefore which would trump the other triumphs in a game of cards once they were incorporated into card games and not just being used to teach the triumphal traditions. So that's pretty interesting. So yeah, I just think it's a good idea to have some of these old decks on hand. I was going to show you I think the love card here is really interesting. So we don't have the 3 humans plus Cupid here, but what we do have, I still kind of think he's making a choice, the person on the left, because he's not looking directly at her, he's looking above her. You can kind of see his gaze goes up over her head. And so I think it's kind of similar to this lover card, where he's got his hand on the choice that he desires, but he's looking at his higher purpose and knowing that that's probably his obligation. So in the Visconti one, that's portrayed, I think, more subtly by his gaze going up into the sky or, looking at a higher purpose. So yeah, just having, like I said, all these historic decks around just really gives you some different layers to look at and think about.